Good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar series on EU budget talks. My name is Ale Asatrian. I'm your host today, and I'm joining you from Mannheim, Germany. I'm joining you from the ZEW, the Center for European Economic Research, and I'm joined today by Paolo Zurico, who is a professor of economics at the London Business School, and by Krastio Preslavsky, who works at the European Commission at the DG Defense. He's acting head of Unit of Defense Industrial Programming Coordination. We will be talking today about the defense priorities for the next MFF, the Multiannual Financial Framework. And this webinar is a part of a larger series of webinars where we'll be talking about various issues concerning the design of the next MFF. The structure of the webinar is as follows. I will start with a short introduction to organize our thoughts. I will have some slides to discuss the main trade-offs facing the MFF negotiations at the high level, then talk a bit about the defense spending by the member states as well as by the European Union, and introduce you to the topic of the economic effects of defense spending. Then I will hand over to Paolo, who is an expert on fiscal policy and monetary policy as well. He has a long research on military spending as well, the multiplier effects of military spending, including of innovation and R&D, who will review the economic literature for you on multipliers from this spending. Then we will hand over the floor to Krastio, who is the policymaker among us, very knowledgeable about the current important programs done by the European Union. He will introduce us to what the Commission is doing, what the European Union is doing in the area of defense spending, and also what they plan to do in the upcoming MFF. After this part, we will have a short summary of what we have learned, and we will discuss what this implies for the next MFF. In the meantime, I welcome all the participants. Thank you for joining today. We hope that you can also actively participate. There is the Q&A option. You are welcome to write down your questions in the chat. In the meantime, I will try to sort them out and direct these questions to our speakers. So let me share my slides. As many of you would know, this is an important time to talk about the MFF. We are entering a critical phase of negotiations regarding the next MFF. And the next MFF is facing big pressures. There are the new priorities of competitiveness. I think we all agree that the continent is facing sluggish growth and competitiveness issues. And at least after the Draghi report of 2024, competitiveness has become one priority, and it is believed that the next MFF has to address this issue. The other is, of course, defense, which has again come to the core after the attack on Ukraine in 2022, but also because of the larger geopolitical concerns. Defense has moved from a niche to a core topic in the EU budget. It was basically non-existent in the previous MFFs, but it has certain programs in the current MFF, which total about 12 billion euros over the 7-year period. But there will be a very large increase in the next MFF. The Commission has proposed last year in July to increase the defense spending in the EU budget to 131 billion euros over the 7 years. The MFF is getting larger to accommodate some of these new priorities. The proposal by the Commission proposes about a 10% increase compared to the previous or the current MFF, which will total 1.26% of the gross national income of the European Union, which is equivalent to 2 trillion euros in nominal prices. This increase is also to accommodate the pressure coming from the need to service the debt that was mostly accumulated because of the Next Generation EU funds. The Commission is proposing that a total of 168 billion euros, which is 8% of the total MFF, will be spent on servicing the interest cost, but also repaying about half of the interest cost and the repayments. And this has become a non-negligible part of the total MFF. Our next webinar in the series will actually focus on the EU debt and on Eurobonds, and this will be held on 10th of June, and it will be hosted by Friedrich Heinemann. The announcement is already online. You're welcome to register for that webinar as well. These pressures on the spending side coming from the tightening fiscal space, but also the new priorities of defense and competitiveness obviously imply that the traditional traditional MFF items like cohesion and the common agricultural policy will have to face a compression. The proposal by the Commission suggests an overall cut of about 14% of these two items together. It leaves the decision to the member states on how to distribute the cuts among the two programs. But even then, it is clear that new debt or new own revenues will still be needed to finance the MFF. There are several proposals for new own revenue sources. One of them is the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and we have agreed to have a webinar on this topic as well. So you see that this is high time. There are many open questions relating to the design of the next MFF, and this is what we will be trying to cover in the several webinar series. Now talking about the topic of today, defense spending. As I was saying, the Commission proposes a very large increase. The proposed defense spending funds amounts to 131 billion euros, which makes a non-trivial share of the total MFF. That's 6.5%. And this is just the budgetary spending from the MFF. Of course, there are other facilities like the Ukraine support program, which will total 123 billion and is financed from common debt. And there are also the safe loan instruments totaling 150 billion. And this is done for a very good reason. Defense is a European public good. It is a textbook example of a European public good. There is no question that compared, for example, to the traditional agricultural funds or the cohesion funds, defense should be financed at the EU level because of the economies of scale and large cross-border externalities. But we have to also recognize that most of the defense spending still remains national. The 131 billion is over 7 years compared to annual national spending that makes only 5% or less of national spending by the member states, which is of course increasing a lot as well. Since 2019, it has increased by about 30% in real numbers. Now it makes 2.1% of GDP in the European Union, and it is projected to raise further targeting 3% or more of GDP. Defense spending by the European Union has a specific focus. It does not finance directly combat-related activities, but it rather supports industry, mobility, and dual-use investments. But even then, we should ask ourselves whether the EU spending is fully complementary or whether it sometimes substitutes the national efforts. And that is why we have Krasio Pleslavsky from DG Defense today with us to review what is happening at the Commission, what the plans are for the next MFF, and talk about this issue of additionality. As economists, we are, of course, very much concerned with the growth effects of this rapidly increasing spending. There is a large academic literature, I would say, mostly focusing on the US, at least from the empirical evidence side. Perhaps a consensus is that in the short run, defense spending can have substantial positive effects on GDP, but design matters to a large degree. And one of the main differences with defense spending in the European Union versus what we know from the United States is that a lot of the defense procurement in the EU are imports. 80% of current procurement has sources the procurement from non-EU suppliers, and it is very intuitive to think that this imported spending does not have the same effects as spending that targets local suppliers, and it may indeed end up having even negative multipliers, given that it is costly for the taxpayer to finance this large spending. Composition matters further. I'm sure Paolo will say something about this. We would expect innovative R&D targeting defense spending to have higher multiplier effects than simple wage spending from defense. Furthermore, there is financing. Of course, tax financing will be more costly rather than debt financing, and timing also matters. Typically, defense is not a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, although we, at the moment, happen to be in the wrong side of the cycle. So even though defense spending can support growth, we should have no illusions that it is a free lunch. There is the issue of crowding out. This spending may crowd out private demand. And also there is the issue of opportunity costs. In the long run, this money can potentially be spent in ways that are more growth friendly. So we have to think carefully about how to design defense spending, both at the member state and the EU levels. And with that, I hand over the floor to Paolo.
Zare, thank you very much. I think it was a very nice setting the scene. My mandate was a little bit to discuss what are the economic effects of defense spending. As Zare said, this is a very growing literature with a very mixed result. And as often economics, there is no silver bullet. Some people talk about the defense dividend and alluding to large multiplier. Some other people talk about the peace dividend, which is the negative of that. When you cut defense spending, you can spend on something else that has larger effect. I must confess I'm not a big fan of either, simply because my understanding of the literature and my interpretation of my own result is that really what matters for the macroeconomic effect of defense spending is what do we spend on? In other words, what is the composition? Often you hear people referring to defense spending as the primary source of funding for breakthrough transformation, for very innovative breakthrough discovery. And I have myself pointed out to the crucial role of the military in the mass production of penicillin during World War II, or the Manhattan Project leading to nuclear energy, or the Cold War period and the Cuba Missile Crisis as instrumental for the GPS. And we've seen itself in general that the government has the ability of generating breakthrough innovation in time of crisis. Think about the COVID vaccine, in which the German government seeding has been able to bring BioNTech to develop those vaccines. All this to say that I'm not sure there is anything special about defense spending and the people that talk about defense, large multiplier talk. When the crisis, when the necessity, where the urgency is to defeat the enemy, then military spending is special. If the challenge and the urgency is to go to the moon, then aerospace public spending is special. If the urgency, if the necessity is to find a COVID vaccine, then health funding is special. My understanding of the data of those historic examples, that what is really special is not defense versus other sector, but is whether the government steer innovation in a particular direction. So if defense spending is tilted toward defense R&D, funds basic research, often in research institute at university, and is able to make breakthrough, which then can be scaled up and commercialized, has been historically for the United States, then the macroeconomic impact of defense spending can actually be quite significant. However, more often than not, defense R&D is only a small share of the total defense spending. This is particularly the case for the European Union. Again, just to put things in context, when you talk about the United States is one of the countries in the world, together with China, with South Korea, with Japan, that does most public R&D as a share of its own GDP. The EU, in comparison, does much less than half. Moreover, 50% of government R&D in the United States is military. So military R&D is really the main focus of government funding in a part of the world that does much more government funding R&D than the European Union. The European Union not only does much less as a share of its own GDP, but less than 10% of of European Union public R&D is in military. In fact, if you take as given the composition of defense spending in the European Union, this is a fraction of what happened in the United States. Why am I emphasizing this? Because the macroeconomic effect of defense spending very much depends on what you spend on. If most of the spending is concentrated on weapons or infrastructure or tanks, the effects tends to be concentrated in the short run and tends to be smaller. Of course, the more, and this was something that Zara was alluding before, the more you import from outside, the more those economic benefits spill over to other countries. So, for example, the decision of exempting defense spending from the fiscal rule in the European Union at a time in which most of the defense spending spill abroad imply an even smaller multiplier. So not only defense spending on weapon and salary generates smaller multiplier, but the more of this spending goes abroad, the lower is this multiplier. So if you compare the composition of defense spending in the US and in the European Union, you would expect the short-run effect to be smaller in the European Union. A, because it's much more tilt on weapon, is much more tilt on procurement, is much more tilt on soldier. And second, because it's much more imported. In effect, the exempt of defense spending within the European Union is an implicit subsidy to the United States, to the defense industry in the United States, like the European one. Second, those multipliers, which tends to be smaller than one, are concentrated in the short run. What is the multiplier is how much, how many euro of GDP can you increase for every increase of defense spending of 1 euro. However, and this is what I show in my own research, is that whenever the composition of defense spending is tilted significantly towards R&D, the short-run effects are similar, perhaps a little bit smaller. But what's happened is that there is a very significant and prolonged increase in productivity. Exactly because military R&D push basic research, the frontier of knowledge, which later the private sector scale up and commercialized. This goes all the examples that we have mentioned before: penicillin, GPS, internet, nuclear energy. COVID vaccine is not military, but it's the same idea. Is that public R&D that is the special weapon of the government rather than a particular sector. And whenever military spending is tilted towards R&D, as has been historical in the United States, this is where we see that the short-run crowding out of private sector actually becomes crowding in. Exactly because that military R&D has generated that increase in productivity that make it convenient, make it profitable for the private sector to chip in, generating a multiplier which in the long run can be significantly above 1. So the lesson I want to draw from my reading of the literature is that it's very easy to be tempted on focusing only on the short run, because understandably, policymakers feel the urge, the need of buying up weapons, of generating a deterrent. However, while this could be very justifiable emotionally, politically, this is likely to buy neither national security, nor technological security, nor economic security. In an era in which technology moves very fast, in which most of the warfare is becoming drone technology and jamming technology, investing so much on procurement not only generates small economic impact, but might not generate the technology deterrent which is needed to convince the enemy not to attack. The bigger risk now is that the European Union is still very much depends on the rest of the world, and in particular the United States, not simply on defense spending, but most importantly on technology. There are tanks, there are aircraft, there are jets which are almost fully produced in Europe, but still their technology updates, even their software update, are entirely outsourced to the United States. This exposed to an immense geopolitical risk that undermine technology security and therefore national security. Often we phrase these defense spending as guns versus battle. If by defense spending we mean procurement to buy more weapons and tanks, then I agree, there is that trade-off. You have a lot of spending, which if we are very lucky, is completely wasteful, because you don't use and become obsolete. And if you are unlucky, generate an economic impact, but there is the destruction of war, economically, humanitarily, and politically and socially. However, it doesn't have to be that way. When defense spending is tilted towards R&D and innovation, you can get both technology deterrent, technology sovereignty, technological leadership, which not only generate the strongest deterrent in this new type of warfare, but also pose the basis for the next generation of technology, which would lead productivity and the macroeconomic impact of defense spending. I will stop here, Zach.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paolo. Before I go to Castio, I have one question. And you mentioned these two constraints, that not enough of the defense spending here is spent on innovation, and that too much of the procurement is imported. The question is why? Is it because of choice, or is it there are certain constraints that force us to do that? And let me also link that to one question that came up in the chat. The question says that the European universities are often banned from doing defense-related research. The question is whether this is a big obstacle for defense spending knowledge spillovers in Europe, and in particular, what would be the role of the European Union?
My conjecture is historical. Europe is behind in terms of innovation, not just in defense, actually in almost the majority of sectors. And for me, the reason is exactly World War II. Basic economic framework of structural transformation. What World War II did is generating an economic boom in the United States, a complete destruction of infrastructure in Europe. So when there was all this capital to use on both sides of the Atlantic, the United States, which had already the infrastructure, decided to spend most of its budget on innovation and generating that ecosystem of innovation that now we know as American technological leadership. Europe missed that large investment, but for a very obvious and good reason. Because investment in innovation take much longer to materialize. A much quicker return can be get from simple capital accumulation. And the country that has been destroyed by war, whose infrastructure has been depleted by bombardment, the most obvious way of using the Marshall Plan was to rebuild that capital, which in fact led to the very strong growth of the 50, the 60, and the 70. But what we know is that capital accumulation doesn't last forever. When the diminishing return of capital dies out, that economic growth dies. So to me, the problem of the innovation in Europe is those missing investment in the 50, in the 60. 50 and 60 where the US mostly invested in NIH, NSF, so education and health. The 60s where Kennedy launched NASA. Europe didn't have any of that in the 50 and the 60 for a very good reason, because it was rebuilding factories and infrastructure that were destroyed during the war. However, the strong economic boom generating a complacency, and this brought to lack of investment in the 80s and the 90s that could have generated that innovation ecosystem that Europe never created. Paradoxically, this increase in defense spending could be that Hamiltonian moment that America lived during World War II. Towards the end of the war, President Roosevelt asked his chief economic advisor, Vannevar Bush, what have we learned from the research mobilization during the war? And this is where he led to say, okay, the government needs to lead with basic research. This has to be done by research institute or university which are unconstrained by commercial goal. And then we need to move in, crowd in the private sector to scale up those new knowledge into new products. Now, this increase in defense spending could go either way. I think it's going to be a moment of make it or break it. If it's going to become a power, a catalyzer of innovation, then Europe could have that moment that the US had in the 50 and the 60, where Europe were reconstructing after World War II. But on the other hand, if this is going to be just let's buy more American weapons, I think it's not going to buy Europe neither economic growth nor technology sovereignty, and even less national security.
Thank you, Paolo. That's a bit of a bleak ending, but maybe Castro has more positive news from what they are doing in Brussels.
Thank you, Zara. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. And Paolo, it was interesting listening to your much more scientific background than what my presentation will be. Because what I would like to do in the next, I understand, 8 minutes is just to give you a factual overview of what is it actually that the European Union and the European Commission is doing. So I would like to start with the past, which in this case means 5-6 years ago, very recent past. Where we are now, what are the different funding opportunities, the different programs. There will be many abbreviations that I will mention. Please bear with me. And then a bit the outlook on the future. What are the future programs? What is the future European Union budget proposal looking like? Now, starting point, the recent past. Until 5-6 years ago, I was working, for example, on civilian R&D, a program called Horizon Europe, before that Horizon 2020, FP7. Many of you know it. So this is a very well-established European Union program supporting collaborative research and development in all areas, transport, health, energy, etc., etc. Defense was a taboo word in the EU context. So member states were saying every time EU, you have nothing to do with defense. It is either a national competence, which of course it remains, or it's something we discuss in NATO. There is no added value for the EU. Now, how the world has changed in 6-7 years, very obvious. You see the challenges for the geopolitical security context. I'm not going to elaborate on that. But basically now we're in a completely different situation. Of course, this is not free lunch, as Zara, you said, but basically this is about investing in our security, making the difference between we having our comfortable, peaceful lives and what people in Ukraine live now through for more than 4 years. Now, starting with the past, just a few years ago, my presentation would have been extremely short. I would have said we do nothing in support of defense. So there was €0 from the European Union budget supporting defense and defense industrial aspects. There were 0 programs, there was 0 people working on that. So my Directorate General, DG Defense of the European Union, for example, didn't even exist 6 years ago. So we start not from a very low base, we start as a European Union from a 0 base, from the ground floor. Now, this also happens in the context of what has been for 3 decades or more than 3 decades now, a very strong underinvestment in defense. We had, of course, the peace dividend. Thanks God, communism fell, the Eastern Bloc disappeared, the Warsaw Pact stopped being a threat for basically life on Earth. So this whole concept of mutual assured destruction, thousands of tactical and strategic nuclear weapons, this was in the history. So we had the peace dividend, but we obviously went too far. We all thought that war is something that happens in other parts of the world or happens only in historical books, romance, the stories of our grandparents. Fast forward 2026, we have conventional war with basically scale not seen in the world since the Second World War in Europe, in Ukraine. We have a growing number of security threats, wars, look at every geographic direction away from Europe. So what the EU has done is to step in an area that is again very sovereignistic. Of course, we do not have a European army. We have 27 armies, we have 27 defense industries, so we have a very fragmented situation on the demand and the supply side. How we started is basically the area on which Paolo elaborated, research and development, because this was the most innocent area. first for member states to agree to collaborate, not about procurement, not about operational doctrines, etc., but to collaborate on developing the next generation technologies, platforms, capabilities that we need to keep Europe safe. So in 2021, in the current EU budget called the Multiannual Financial Framework, we have one big program called the European Defence Fund, which support collaborative research and development projects. So this is again about the future. This is investment in innovation. This is investment in all military domains. We have projects related to air combat, air and missile defense, naval combat, ground combat, name it, every single area. Now we have a total budget of a bit more than 1 billion euro per year, which for research in the research and development in defense is a meaningful amount of money. I'm not making the comparison with other players. The US obviously invests much more, but again, starting from zero just 5-6 years ago, now we have become one of the top 3 investors in defense R&D in Europe. So major tectonic shift. And the added value of the European Union programs is, of course, that we are not replacing national efforts. All our countries are investing more than they were investing 5 years ago, of course, starting from a very low base. But we see that they are investing in what Paolo explained, namely big focus on procurement. We need to procure a lot of stuff, and actually we need to procure the same stuff. Everyone is now looking at procuring air and missile defense systems after 30 years of underinvestment in the areas. Everyone is looking at drones, anti-drones, etc. What we don't see is a similar parallel increase in the investment in research and development. So this is where the EU budget has added value. So here we are on one side supporting the future. So this is really an economically interesting investment, but this is not the subject of my speech now today. But what we managed to do is to defragment the R&D effort, because R&D in the area of defense is so complex and so expensive. Even the big countries like France, Germany, they cannot afford doing it alone. So we are now supporting more than 260 projects in all military domains, involving a very impressive number of individual players. So these are companies, research organizations. Increasingly, there was a question about universities. More and more universities are getting involved in military or defense R&D. So we have almost 1,700 European players participating in our projects. So we are really defragmenting the European defense industrial landscape, and in particular the R&D world. We already have more than 50 prototypes being developed in all domains. So these are actually things that will enter soon or are already entering the armed forces of our member states. You will not be surprised, the top beneficiaries of our program are companies that we all know, companies like Leonardo, Thales, Airbus, Saab, Indra, MBDA, Fincantieri, Navanti, and Navar Group. So the big players are there, but importantly, this is not just a program for the big players. This is really a unique opportunity to create collaboration between non-traditional players that are increasingly the engine of innovation in defense. Now, 2022 happened, so Russia invaded Ukraine, or invaded Ukraine again, or invaded Ukraine for a third time, or full-scale invasion. Doesn't mean how you say it. But the political dynamics and the security dynamics in Europe changed. So member states said, of course, investing in R&D is important, but we actually have the current challenge that we don't have a sufficient industrial capacity for production. Think about artillery shells, for example, where Russia is still outproducing Europe and the US. And we have a big, which is also an economic problem. We're not spending our money sufficiently because basically everyone procures separately, nationally. Even if you're allies, I don't know, for 70 years in NATO, for 30 years in the EU, even if you need the same kind of capabilities, in 80% of the cases, we buy separately. So we developed 2 new programs, one called ASAP, which was basically focused on addressing the industrial bottlenecks that did not allow Europe to produce more artillery shells, large caliber. The focus was 155 millimeter artillery shells, but this means the whole supply chain, explosives, powder, components, and the final assembly. And the other very interesting program was called EDIRPA. So this is the first time we mobilized EU budget to incentivize member states to procure together. Because again, our systematic problem in Europe, we are now investing more. And as Paolo said, it's really a make it or break it point. Either we will invest separately nationally, or we'll invest cleverly together and ideally more European. So from this angle, we support it with a bit of money, not a lot of money for procurement, because procurement in defense is really, really expensive. I don't know if the audience knows, but only one main battle tank costs more than 30 million euro. Of course, you don't buy one tank, you need to buy a battalion, a brigade. So only one brigade of, just the main battle tanks without the supporting vehicles, without training, costs multi-billion. So this is more than the national budgets of many EU member states for defense. So what we incentivize is we give a bit of money to member states if they procure together, which for us means more than 3 member states procuring together. And with this test program, we actually opened the doors for common procurement. My country, or the country I know best, has never procured anything meaningfully together with another member state. Now, thanks to our programs, they saw that yes, actually, you can procure together with Germany, together with Estonia, together with Austria, air missile defense systems, and then, of course, interoperability questions solved by themselves. So this is where we are. Currently, we have one big program supporting R&D called the European Defense Fund. For those of you interested or who know defense R&D players, we currently have open calls for proposals. So these are open for industry at the amount of 1.1 billion euro. So by September, European industry can apply for funding under the EDF. Now, before I finish looking at the future, we have a new program called the European Defense Industry Program, so EDIP, which basically continues the logic that we support the ramping up of production capacity on one side, and on the other side, we support member states to procure together. And we also look at a brand or novel concept called European Defense Projects of Common Interest, where really big, strategic, meaningful projects where no member state can go ahead alone. Think about air and missile defense, think about space, think about maritime or underwater infrastructure. And here we want to combine and have a holistic approach towards, on one side, the procurement, on the other side, support to industry to be able to produce what member states want to procure, and then also looking at the command and control, etc., etc. So we have just open calls for proposals for around 1.5 billion euro. Another interesting element, collaboration with Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, for very sad reasons, is the country in the world that has the best experience with defense innovation. So for the first time ever, we have in EDIP possibilities to fund collaboration between European companies, Ukrainian companies, which also allow us to learn from the lessons they have learned with their blood. Now, another very interesting angle, of course, EU budget is relatively big, but it is incomparably smaller compared to national budgets, and it's of course very small compared to the actual defense needs of the member states. So what the European Commission suggested last year was, we said, listen guys, you all want to procure, you actually have the defense need to quickly procure a lot of stuff. I mean, this was what Paolo explained, platforms, etc., etc. So if we do it together, we can offer the possibilities for those of you who are interested that the European Union takes a common loan on behalf of member states, which means for most member states, this means much better financial conditions. And we had 19 member states who were interested to participate in the scheme. This is an initiative called SAFE, where basically in the next 2-3 months, there will be an unprecedented wave of around 150 billion euro at the availability of the member states for them to procure the urgently critical needed capabilities. Think about air and missile defense systems, think about anti-drone systems, etc., etc. And this combined with what the previous speaker also mentioned, this additional fiscal flexibility that allows member states to invest more in defense without this being counted to their debt. I'm oversimplifying, of course, allows an unprecedented wave of national investment in acquiring defense capabilities. And then to complete, a look forward to the future EU budget. In Europe, we operate with this framework of 7 years that we call the Multiannual Financial Framework, the complicated way to see the EU budget. So we are currently at the end of the current EU budget, so it will expire next year in 2027. Imagine it was negotiated by the member states and the parliament in 2019 in a completely different geopolitical reality. This was pre-Ukraine war, this was pre-COVID, etc., etc. Now, the most interesting and most complex discussions in the EU are now ongoing or starting, which are the discussions how the next budget will be concentrated or invested. And this is where the Commission has made its proposal, namely that defense becomes one of the top priorities. If I make again the reference to my starting pitch, in the past there was €0 from the EU budget related to defense. In the current MFF, the defense-related expenditure are still very, very limited. It's less than 1% of the total EU budget that goes in support of the initiatives that I mentioned. A comparison with Russia, in Russia, more than 40% of the federal budget is now being invested in defense, or okay, in their case, this is also attack, not defense. Of course, it's not a fair comparison. In EU, I'm talking about the EU budget, so the common budget. We do not operate an European Union army, but just if you compare the political narrative and the prominence you see in media about spending in defense with the actual amounts, starting from 0, we are now at less than 1%, and the ambition is for the next MFF to have a much higher envelope, so we call it a window. What the Commission has proposed is a window of €131 billion for 7 years that will cover defense and space and security. So it's not only for defense, but a big part of this will be for defense. In addition, the Commission suggests a significant increase of the money that will be invested in military mobility. So we're talking about infrastructure, but not only infrastructure, which of course is it's not only military infrastructure. This is also something useful for our civilian economic life. Think about better interconnectivity, better highways, bridges, tunnels, etc., etc. So this is the proposal of the Commission. Now this is in the hands of the member states and the Parliament. It's a political decision how much will be spent on agriculture, how much on culture, how much on defense. On the positive side, I think there is a growing awareness about the importance of defense. Maybe a final footnote before I finish. I hope many of you have heard about Eurobarometer. Eurobarometer is the public opinion tool of the European Commission, where we survey what are the public opinions in the different member states, what people consider to be the top challenges, what is the level of trust in national government, what is the level of trust in the EU, etc., etc. And from these regular public opinion surveys, we see that in every single member state in the EU, no matter, if you're Estonia, where the Russian army is virtually one small river away from you, or Portugal or Cyprus, where we saw, of course, now that even for Cyprus, suddenly a war in the Middle East became also, practically implicated the lives and the lives there. So there is a growing majority of people in all our member states saying, yes, defense is increasingly important. Yes, after decades of underinvesting in defense, we need to compensate this underinvestment. And we need to not only invest more, but we need to invest together, and we need to invest European, which for me means to invest cleverly. So with this, I hope it was not a too fast overview of many, many developments and programs. And I hand the word back to you, Zarek.
Yes, thank you very much, Krastyo, both for reviewing the programs done by the EU budget, but also about this coordinating role. For example, you talked about the initiatives that help member states procure together, even the big ones. So in general, it seems that both of you are advocating to more defense spending at both levels, the member state and EU levels, which is, I understand that.
I don't.
You don't?
I want to make it clear. The problem of Europe is not how much it spends in defense; is about the composition. Of course, so Krasti had a couple of very nice lines about spending more in defense, spend more in agriculture, spend more in these. I wish I could have heard spending more on innovation, which could be defense and non-defense. And to me, this is what actually is missing at the moment in Europe. So if more defense spending means more spending on innovation, yes, I'm advocating that. If more defense spending means to buy 7 tanks from 7 different national maker and account with foreign components and software, I'm against increase in defense spending.
Maybe my quick take on this.
Yeah.
Of course, you'll not be surprised. Of course, I have a slightly different reply, but you see that actually it's the same reply as Paolo. Objectively, after decades of underinvesting in defense, we need to catch up on this investment. If you look at the military capabilities of our member states, we have completely demilitarized ourselves. There are certain countries in Europe which did not do that, but these are more the exceptions. Countries like Finland, countries like Greece. But we are in a situation where we actually have a neighboring country that has declared all our individual countries to be hostile or enemy. We're in a situation where, for example, in terms of air and missile defense, if I look at the country I know best, the last time my country bought an air defense system or a radar to observe the airspace was when I was a young teenager. So these capabilities are obviously irrelevant for the year 2026. And this is in a moment where every single day there is a drone landing around the country I know best. So objectively, we need to invest more. And here is where I agree with, just because I think for the general audience, it's not clear how much we have been demilitarizing ourselves. But of course, we don't need to go back to the terrible times of the Cold War. We're talking about mutually assured nuclear destruction. But if Germany, for example, since you're based in Mannheim, had 4,000 main battle tanks in the early 90s, currently Germany has something like 300 something. My country had 1,000. Currently, it has 70 tanks. Now, tanks are not the gold standard of 2026. I'm not giving this as an example, but we are completely naked, or not completely naked, but much more naked than we should be to be able to dissuade an next aggression. And here we come to the second element, which is how to spend this money, because we obviously need to spend them intelligently. The most easy and most conservative traditional way would be each one of us, 27 member states, we spend nationally, we procure quickly from whoever is available, South Korea, Turkey, the US, platforms, etc., etc. This will only lead to further fragmentation. If we invest cleverly, if we invest, as Paolo says, in R&D, in innovation, in non-traditional defense players, if we invest more European and more together, this will make the difference between just throwing money out of a helicopter and buying 7 tanks from 7 different producers with zero effect on national security, or investing together. So again, different angle, but I think we come to the same conclusions with Paolo.
I agree. If I can rephrase what you said with the provocation, you can increase military spending as Russia did, or you can increase military spending as Ukraine did. And we can only wish that we did as Ukraine rather than Russia.
The question is still, how are you going to finance that? Especially when talking about the EU budget. I know none of you is an expert of the common agricultural policy, but how do you see this financed? Is it coming through cuts in the other items, or is it more debt? Is it more own taxes at the EU level?
So very briefly, given we have only 6 minutes left. So of course there are many forms of government spending that can be cut when there are inefficiency, but this should not go down to guns versus butter. Because as Crastio said, some of these necessity, these catching up, it has to be so brutal, so large, it makes much more sense for borrowing to do the heavy lift. And the idea of having a common issuance is exactly to help, especially the peripheral country with the less fiscal credibility, to take advantage of the common issuance to generate lower interest rate. But I want to add some, but this idea that borrowing is the economically more valuable and sustainable form of financing is linked to two implications that are often not well appreciated, and I want to emphasize here. That borrowing for defense is economically and fiscally much more sustainable, again, if that defense spending is on innovation, because innovation generates those returns that allow to pay back the debt. If again, all this defense spending goes to tank that we hope never use, then this is not going to be sustainable. It's going to make the fiscal problem larger. So exemption from the budget for innovation makes sense. For all defense procurement make less sense. Which brings me to the second point that I think is very important, and someone mentioned in the chat with a question. The biggest gap, I mentioned the gap in public R&D between US and EU. But actually, I'm co-authoring a chapter of this with the EU DG Commission on Science and Technology, with Florence Hubert and Paolo Pasimeni. And there we noticed that the largest difference between US and the EU is private R&D as a share of GDP. What the EU is missing is funds for later stage startup to scale up. Europe is not short of innovator, is not short of talent, is not short of university, but is short of private funds going to European innovator. Where are those funds? For me, defined contribution pension funds is a huge untapped resources. Because of the defined contribution structure, those are investment into equity that most of the time goes into US equity. If public funds from the European Union could generate a co-investment vehicle that could be used by defined contribution pension funds to co-invest on European equity and allow later stage startup to scale up in Europe, I think this could generate the funding for the increase in defense spending tilts it toward innovation, because for every euro of EU funding spending, there could be an extra euro of pension funds, which now will have a strong incentive to invest in European equity because the European Union is de-risking them by putting 50% of that investment.
Okay, thank you, Paolo. As the tradition goes, we end the webinar with quick responses to a takeaway message. And the question for today, to both of you, is what is the most important defense-related priority for the next MFF you would like to stress? Something that perhaps is not so much visible in the current debate. But 30 seconds each, please. Paolo?
For me, is the importance of innovation and the crowding in of the private sector through defined contribution pension funds. These two together could generate technology sovereignty and fiscal sustainability in a way that would also foster and encourage national security.
Thank you. Bastio?
Okay, difficult in 30 seconds, but my take is defense is not about weapons. Defense is about the societal readiness to defend our way of life. So, of course, there is the economic angle. Of course, there is the angle of procuring stuff. Of course, there is the angle of industrial ramp up. But at the end of the day, we're talking about the readiness and showing the readiness to any potential aggressor, that you have a critical mass of citizens who are ready, like the Ukrainians surprised Putin, to fight for their freedom and for their life. And this also means media literacy. This means education. This means that the Russian propaganda cannot work with its fake lies in a significant part of your society. So we should look at the economic angle, we should look at the purely defensive angle, but it is really about the defense readiness of the society to protect the European way of life.
Okay, thank you very much, Bastio and Paolo. We have exhausted our time, so also let me thank all the participants of the webinar today. And I would like to announce the next seminar, which is going to take place on the 10th of June. It will be about the EU debt and Euro bonds to finance the EU debt, hosted by Philip Heinemann from the CEW. Thank you for joining again, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.